I know we have at least a few in our midst this morning. We might have some, who knows, online watching that have been in military service. I'm not positive if we have. We might have one or two this morning that have seen some actual battle, or as we say, seen combat. I'm not going to ask you to stand up or even raise your hands this morning, but I do ask this morning that you think about that question. Have you ever been to war? Have you ever been at war? A battle. A battle. And then I invite you to take out your Bibles and turn with me to Second Corinthians chapter 10, the 10th chapter of Second Corinthians. Regardless of whether you have seen what we perhaps first think of when we think of war, whether you've seen combat or you've been in the military or not, I'm convinced that you have been at war. I'm convinced more so that you are at war. There's a battle, or there are battles between God and his people and, let's say, Satan and those that, whether knowingly or not, are his. There's battles. The battle has been won. Our Savior has taken care of that. What I'm thinking of this morning, you might call battles or a battle of world views. The way that we see the world creates conflict. It's bound to. Let's read together from Second Corinthians now. Now, this is the Holy Spirit speaking through Paul. And I suggest this morning, when Paul says we, he's thinking of himself and the other apostles. We might enlarge that group slightly, but it easily then applies to us as all of God's people, even today, as all disciples of Jesus. The way that we should look at not only the fact there is a war, but the way that we fight the war is defined for us in this passage. 2 Corinthians 10, 1 through 6. He says, I, Paul, myself entreat you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. I, who am humble when face to face with you, but bold toward you when I am away. I beg of you that when I am present, I may not have to show boldness with such confidence as I count on showing against some who suspect us of walking according to the flesh. For though we walk in the flesh, we are not waging war. It's a battle. We are not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. Quick comment there. Notice that although he's emphasizing we're not fighting a fleshly war, and part of this is our battle is not about actual physical warfare as we might normally think of war. Our battle is not fleshly. We might use the word spiritual or intellectual even, or worldview battle. But he also, on the other side of it, is emphasizing that this is still a big war. And what we're able to do through the truth of Jesus is powerful, like pulling down a stronghold. Then he goes on to say, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. And if you want the battle plan of the enemy for that time and our time, that might be one easy way to describe it. Lofty opinions raised against God's knowledge, or the knowing God. And then finally, the passage concludes, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience. And this might be where you consider the immediate application of the apostles and their authority when your obedience is complete. With this idea in mind of a battle of worldviews, a warfare that is not fleshly, but against arguments and opinions that are against God, let's examine together three battles under the overall battle of worldviews. Three battles for this morning. Now, a quick heads up. There are going to be several times, and I'm going to try to say this now and not have to repeat myself much, if at all. There's going to be several times when we're going to look at something. I'll go ahead and give you the overlook there. We're going to look at something and move on very quickly, and even make reference to much deeper looks. And that's not because we don't want to get into it. It's because this is designed as an overview this morning. And some of these topics, because they do get a bit technical, they might be better in a class or even a small discussion group or maybe a Sunday evening sermon even. Some of these might be better in those contexts anyway, because they do get, you start walking and you fall into the deep end pretty quickly if you're not careful. So we're going to try to be careful in how we do this in overview or overlook fashion as we think about life versus death. And if you like to have the rhymes that help sometimes with memory, you could put creation there versus evolution. Life versus death is our formal subtitle for this morning there. Then global versus local. And then we'll conclude by considering fact or fiction. Fact versus fiction. Our first one this morning then, one battle is life versus death. And this is about God, His reality itself, but also about those who may hold to some form of theism. They believe there is a God. They believe in some kind of even creator God. But yet also hold on, and it's as if, and you could think of straddling a fence. You could think of being pulled by two different ropes, and you're the middle part of the tug of war, where I want to hold on to God, but I also want to hold on to evolution. And I'm not referring to microevolution this morning, but macroevolution. That's another one of those we could get into, but we'll say we're talking about the full dramatic story here. Let's imagine this morning that you're walking along the seashore. I know we're in landlocked Oklahoma, but just imagine you're at the beach. And you're walking along the beach, and you find a very beautiful, very intricate sandcastle. What's your thought? And there's nobody around. There's no person or persons. There's no equipment, nothing. No buckets, nothing. What do you think? And again, this is an actual sandcastle. It's not a clump of sand that you think looks like a castle like we do with looking at clouds. Actual sandcastle. Well, of course, your first thought is that the tide was higher, and as the tide was up, those waves, over a period of time, and I guess it had to be only a few hours for this one, somehow made that sandcastle. Who wants to raise their hand and agree with that one? Well, no, then that's why you're looking around to see where the people are, or the whatever, we'll just say people, made this. Aliens and stuff, right? But something made it, right? It didn't just happen. Now, blow that up. A much bigger scale. How do you get from nothing to something? Even more, how do you get from inorganic material to organic? How does that work? How do you get then from non-life to life? To living, breathing, thinking, reasoning? And we've moved pretty far now, right? From bare material matter to plants and animals and humanity. Another way to ask that question from a mathematical standpoint is, what are the odds? What are the odds? Even some who hold to the idea that everything evolved from everything before it, if you will, even they will say and give you the numbers that the odds are astronomical. It is incredible to start looking at the zeros you have to start adding to the odds. The odds. Just like the sandcastle, which is it hardly compares, right, to the detail and the vastness of our world. Which one of those explanations not only makes more sense, which one makes any sense? That it just happened by chance? And that's the idea supposed here, is you give something enough time and enough random chance, and somehow everything that exists today now exists. Keep in mind that chance is just chance. It's just numbers. It does not initiate something. It does not make something. It's just numbers. It's chance. It's randomness based on something else acting and being involved. Part of why I put life versus death here is because the God of the universe, the God of the Bible that we read about in passages like Genesis 1 and 2, He's a God of life, a God of creation. He is not a God of death. He's not. Now, as a part of the consequences of even some of our behavior, death becomes a part of the picture, and God is involved in that, but He is not a God of death. And yet, to hold to something like theistic evolution that says, well, yes, there's a creator, but the creator used evolution. It says a number of things, and there are a number of failure points, but one of the things that says is that God intentionally relied on not just a few, but we're talking millions upon millions of deaths to create, and I'm using that word pretty loosely at this point, the final product. And from the day-age theory to the gap theory or progressive creation in general, there are several issues that are beyond our place this morning when it comes to what's called theistic evolution. Genesis 1 and 2 describes God creating everything with His voice. There is no progressiveness beyond the days of the week when He creates different things in 6 days. By the way, that's where we get our week from, is the 7 days of God's work. You can compare passages like 1 Corinthians that describe the first Adam and the latter or the last Adam. Comparing Adam married to Eve, that man in Genesis 1 and 2, and then the true second Adam, the human to restore, was lost by the first Adam, Jesus. That's part of the issue where this really begins to, the rubber starts meeting the road, is that if I start looking at Genesis 1 and 2 as a pretty loose idea of what God did, how far am I going to take that? And if I'm not sure about the first Adam, maybe he's just a picture, just a holding place for humanity in Genesis 1 and 2, how sure am I about the second Adam in 1 Corinthians 15, 22, and 45? According to the Bible, not only do we see creation, we see that decay and disease and death, at least for humanity. Now, animals is a bit deeper discussion, but at least for humanity, those things were introduced into this world by sin. Through Satan's power and man's giving into that temptation, sin brought those things. Look at Genesis 3. Then compare that with a plain, very plain prose passage in a letter called Romans 5, 12 through 14, where through one man, death entered our world. Life versus death. When you start looking at evolution versus creation, one of the questions as well is it really science? Is it really even about the science? Or is it about religion? I'll give you some homework if you want some. You're probably familiar with Charles Darwin. You can look at Charles Darwin's the religious side of his life, and compare that with the theory, the idea of evolution. It's not a completely brand new thing with Darwin, but what we tend to see today taught in schools and assumed within mass media is based on Darwin's work. But another name to look up is Huxley. Thomas Henry Huxley. He's the guy that followed Darwin. Take a look at even some of the things that Huxley openly admits about evolutionary processes, believing in them being not so much scientific as much as the creation of a new religion. It was a new religious system of belief. It's a worldview, and it has religious connotations. The God of heaven and earth, the Creator who's loving and good and wise, life versus death. But then we turn our attention to global versus local. How many of you remember, the best I could discover, it was in 2015, the big flood. There were several homes, I think about 40, that had to be evacuated here in Elk City. Anybody remember that? 2015-ish? Big flood. Anybody? Okay, nobody. I got two people. Okay, somebody in the back. You're my friends for today. I remember living in Cordell and seeing it on the news and seeing all the evacuations or reports of them. And then we decided to move to Elk City a year later. I'm not sure exactly how that worked out. But what do you do when a flood's coming? You build an ark, right? That's the way to escape a flood, right? And then you might need somebody to come rescue you on your rooftop in a boat. But the answer is to evacuate and get away, get to higher ground. But the flood that is recorded in the biblical record in Genesis 6 through 9, we're told, here's the battle, we're told that was a local flood. At the largest, it was Mesopotamia. And we're laughed at to suggest as Christians that it was a global event. But there's the biblical record. And I don't know how you can read Genesis 6 through 9 or even 2 Peter 3 and come away with any indication that it was anything but a worldwide, total, catastrophic, world-reshaping event. In fact, Peter compares it to what's going to happen in the future. He says he compares what happened with the water to what's going to happen with fire. Of course, there you stop and ask, Noah prepared, am I ready? And we saw more of that last Sunday morning, so we won't dwell on that too much. And if I didn't put this on the handout of the screen, but if you're a mind to, you might jot down Genesis 7, 18 through 20. It's where it describes the floodwaters covering the highest mountaintops by their measurements of 15 cubits. By the way, do you know the water clearance of the ark? If you do the math based on the height and the width, the size of the ark, the experts in shipmaking and nautical travel will tell us the ark had exactly 15 cubits of water clearance. There's the biblical record. We could even step away from the biblical record if we wanted to and look at the geological record. For example, why is it, and this is all around the world, why is it that all around the world there are aquatic fossils in some of the highest mountain ranges? That's the data. Keeping in mind that the evidence, the data, it's just data. What you do with it, how you explain it, that's a different part of the process. Just a question. What do you do with that? What do you do with fossils like this? And I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. It's like orthotic nolitoids or something, and I'm pretty sure I butchered that. I'm a preacher. I'm not a biologist, and some of you will get that later if you haven't. But what do you do with fossils like this? And what you're seeing is a picture that indicates the geologists have will confirm that indicates fossils that were deposited in a very quick and with a directional current, not slow, gradual deposits. Global or local? How I view that event of divine judgment does change how I view God and how I view the biblical record in general. Global versus local. Now, one more for this morning. Fact versus fiction. Let's say you are reading the diary, or maybe it might even be a part of the defense for a man accused of a very major crime. Or you're reading even a reporter's account of an interview and information about the situation. And the man claims innocence. The reporter is writing, showing, here's his innocence. Just because it is the man on trial and it is a reporter who writes positively, does that mean you discount what you read outright? The innocence of the person in mind and the view of the person writing about him doesn't tell you whether what's written is true or not. Just because you have an agenda, just because you're trying to communicate something, that doesn't tell you one way or the other whether that is true. What do we do with Jesus? Jesus. Was Jesus a real person? And that one's very surface level because most people, even secular scholars, don't deny that fact. It's one of those things you bring up and most people are going to laugh at you because it's pretty certain that somebody named Jesus was a rabbi that got kind of popular in the first century Judean world. The deeper question is the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Are those reliable? Are they historical? So it's not so much was Jesus fact or fiction, but is the Jesus presented to us in the Bible fact or fiction? That's the question. There are then the primary sources. Sometimes those are discounted from the start. And it might be because, well, Matthew, he was a disciple of Jesus. Luke became a disciple of Jesus. You can't trust anything they say. Or Jesus' own words. You can't trust Jesus. You don't even know if what you read about is what Jesus actually said. When did we start removing primary sources from historical studies? Keep this in mind as well. We don't have a lot of writings about one person from the ancient world. It goes up to a whole other level. If they didn't personally write something, we usually have one source. If you're lucky, two sources. We've got four, and really with some extra on with Acts and the letters, but at least four primary, relatively lengthy sources. That doesn't tell us whether it's true or not, but it makes it easier to look at from the standpoint of history, of authenticity. Check the boxes. We don't just have the primary sources, we also have the secondary sources. And I didn't put these on the screen, they should be on your handout. There are men like Tacitus, the Roman senator, consul, and eventually historian, who writes about the disciples in the early Christian movement, if you will. And not only that they were there and they follow a man that he calls Christus or the Christ, he tells us about their core beliefs. There are those like Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor, who writes about them to his emperor. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, who writes about these disciples of a Jew from Nazareth. Josephus is one who tells us about his siblings and their involvement early on, not in his life, but early on in what we now call Christianity. Present that this morning, fact or fiction. If we take out, for the moment, for the sake of discussion, if we take out the supernatural, the miraculous, and we look at Jesus and his life from a purely historical standpoint, the primary and secondary sources as historical documents alone, especially with members of the immediate family of the person in mind being a part of a movement involving them. And there's no reason to question their sincerity or their sanity. What other life would we even begin to truly question as being factual or not? What changes the discussion is when you put the supernatural back in and you start looking at Jesus' miracles and the idea of his true identity as not just the Messiah, but also as God in flesh. Then the battle becomes one of backpedaling and, oh wait, this can't be real after all. Jesus, as a real, not just person, but as a reliable account, or concerning a reliable account of his life. It is beyond our scope today to look deeper at some of those boxes. But we can examine it and come away with a confidence that says, what I have is reliable. What I do with that, what I do with the question of Jesus' identity, that becomes the next part of the discussion, and that becomes more personal for me. What will I do with the historical accounts about Jesus? We've seen 3 battles this morning. A battle about life versus death. A battle of a good creator and our belief in him, our trust in him, or a belief in blind chance. A battle between a global flood that was divine judgment on a sinful world with a preview of what's to come, or just a local flood. A battle between a real Jesus that I can trust, or one that might be a mixture of some fact and some not so factual after all. There's a battle to be fought. Where are you today? You knew that was coming, right? Where are you today in the battle? Are you willing to fight the battle? Or are you more prone to try and find some kind of compromise and a ceasefire? Let's not deal with it. Let's not confront it. Let's just accept what we're told, and if we believe it, maybe not, but let's don't stir anything up. Are we willing to say, no, this is what's true and this is what's right? This is, for one thing, what makes sense in a battle, not just of worldviews, not just of our hearts and lives, but of our children and grandchildren's too. Where are you in the war between truth and falsehood? We'd like to help you today. We're here to pray for you, to pray with you, to help you to become a disciple of Jesus of Nazareth. Put him on and live daily for him, his cross, his resurrection, and his return someday to take us to be with him forever. If we can help you today, would you let us know? Please stand together. Sing.